I feel like with each new prophet that we turn to in the Bible, I find myself saying again, I'm really grateful God didn't call me to be a prophet like one of the prophets in the Bible, because they had a difficult job. And we can say that about every single one of them. And to give you a sense of how tough Ezekiel's job was, having to preach a challenging word and a difficult word to people who also would end up losing their homes and seeing the temple in Jerusalem destroyed, people who weren't listening to God and to God's word and not following God's commandments. And Ezekiel chapter 2, and part of the call or commissioning of Ezekiel, we hear the Lord saying the following to the prophet: "And you, O mortal, do not be afraid of them, and do not be afraid of their words. Though briers and thorns surround you, and you live among scorpions, do not be afraid of their words, and do not be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house." Continues in verse 7, "You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house." Couple things about these verses. First of all, that term that in the New Revised Standard Version is translated as mortal literally means son of man. And that occurs 93 times in the book of Ezekiel. That word in Hebrew that's translated mortal or son of man, depending on what translation you're looking at. And that emphasizes basically Ezekiel's finite dependence and insignificance before God's infinite power and glory. And, it's like, who am I? I'm just a human being. And God is trying to motivate Ezekiel to speak God's word to them, whether people hear or refuse to hear. And part of what God is saying to Ezekiel as a prophet is, your responsibility is to speak my word. Whether people follow it or not, that will be up to them. But he warns them twice that the people he is speaking to, they are a rebellious house. Have you ever been asked to do something by somebody who had a level of authority over you, and they said, I want you to do this, but just know it may be virtually impossible for you to do it? How would you feel being given that assignment? I think that's got to be a little bit about how Ezekiel feels. He's called to speak God's word to a rebellious house who may not listen, and yet he needs to be faithful and do what God is telling him to do. And that's one of the things about the prophets that we all can learn for our own life as well. We are called to be faithful, even though the results may ultimately not be up to us. They're up to God.